Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and the Season 1 of War Within is fast approaching, which means dungeons and raids will get higher levels of difficulty from normal, heroic, and even mythic. And with the seasonal content finally arriving, you want to make sure that you get your characters prepped and ready to go. And one of the better, more exciting looking characters for raiding content will be the Spec of Subtlety Rogue in particular. Assassination should be a fairly strong competitor as long as it's tuned correctly, but Subtlety has a special edge above other rogues and above other melee because of its flexibility with cooldowns and the vanish cooldown reduction, which was added way back during Dragonflight that continues to shine heading forward into War Within. Combined together with some impactful hero talents between the Trickster and the Deathstalker, Subtlety is setting itself to be as a very powerful option when it comes to pure single-target raiding content. This is why I want to go over Subtlety rogues and how to get them prepped and ready for Season 1 in the War Within when it comes to raids primarily, but also talking a bit about the playstyles and availability within Mythic Plus dungeons. Also, everything in this guide will be available in the description section, or at least all the important parts like talents and builds and all the important info. But also, if you join our Discord channel, we'll have a written version of this guide available so you can reference it for later uses. But as always, if you guys want to see more regular updates and guides like these for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, let's dive right into how to play Subtlety in War Within Season 1. So first things first, what is new for the Spec of Subtlety heading into the Season 1 of War Within? For the most part, not a lot. Subtlety's walking into this expansion feeling familiar to not only Dragonflight, but all the previous iterations of Subtlety from other expansions, because the Spec has always ended up defaulting to a bursty, cooldown heavy maniac that it has been since like Legion, even towards tail end of BFA, as well as Dragonflight. So the class itself is still very iconic with its focus on big burst, careful planning, and a lot of cooldown management. There's just way too many cooldowns for one to manage. We'll try to break down the cooldown section as best as we can, but the only thing that's really different this time around are the hero talents, which add a little bit of flavor to every single spec in a game, but also some rotational changes for Subtlety in particular. Deathstalker is one that's focused on big finisher damage with Deathstalker's Mark, churning out a bunch of finishers to deal instant damage, buffing the next backstab or Shadow Strike. Those eventually convert into a Darkest Night, which gives you an empowered version of Eviscerate that deals critical strike damage like as a guarantee. So it's a very, very potent ability that's going to reward you with a ton of damage. But this one is probably one of the more passive setups that isn't super involved. You have random moments of plague damage and random shadow damage, but this is the more passive option. Trickster, on the other hand, is a little bit different, as it offers you some actual new gameplay changes, but it plays around getting procs of Unseen Blade, which leaves the target's phased, making them take more damage from you. Your certain abilities can build up a damage buff for all of your finishers, and then your Eviscerate can eventually transform into a massive finisher called Coup de Grace, which has a very specific use case out of it, but we'll get into the Trickster and Deathstalker and how they affect the playstyle of the spec once we get into some of the basics. Speaking of the basics, let's get into the talent tree, because that's usually where I always look for when it comes to guides. I want to make sure I get the talents right before I start playing around with a class in dungeons and raids. So for Subtlety, for single target, you're primarily going to have a one core build that doesn't really change depending on your hero spec. It's mostly going to play around the ability of Without a Trace, which is now found in the class talent tree, which is going to give you an extra vanish. This will be combined together with Invigorating Shadow Dust Subtlety talent, which is going to give you cooldown reduction for all abilities whenever you vanish with your Subtlety rogue. This means it's going to push some of your major cooldowns, such as your Shadow Blades in particular, as well as your Flagellation, up a little. So you're not going to be playing around a 2-minute window, but rather like a 1.5-ish minute window or so, or maybe even a little bit faster. But the single target raid build is going to focus on double dance or double vanish rather, together with Deeper Stratagem, Cold Blood, as well as prioritizing Invigorating Shadow Dust. The Cleave and AoE build isn't going to be all that different. With the current form of the Cleave and AoE build, we're still prioritizing Invigorating Shadow Dust, because being able to flexibly move around our cooldowns is still a huge benefit to the Subtlety rogue. Though we're not going to be investing into a double vanish, because we just need to be able to use those cooldowns a little quicker. But the ability and the playstyle going into Subtlety adds a little bit more consistency, and it just ends up synergizing better within dungeon content. We are also going to be picking up a little bit of AoE and cleaving talents like Replicating Shadows, but we're not going to be committing heavily into pure AoE. We'll actually be mostly prioritizing single target damage, because we're able to play the hero spec of Trickster. And we'll talk about how Trickster affects a lot of this gameplay when we get into the Trickster section, but Trickster is basically going to unlock a Cleave and AoE potential while allowing us to retain a good portion of our single target focus, which is a much better profile for dungeon content. And both of these talent builds, whether it is the single target version of Deathstalker as well as Trickster, as well as the AoE Trickster variation, both of those are going to be available over in the description of this video or on our written version of the guide on the Dalaran Discord. But from there, we can now move on into talking about the playstyle and the rotation of a Subtlety rogue. Subtlety, like all other rogues, is a class all about building and spending combo points as efficiently as possible. Some of your abilities are going to build combo points, which increase the effectiveness of your finisher abilities, and when you use finisher abilities such as Slice and Dice to buff yourself, a Rupture to bleed the target, or Eviscerate to deal instantaneous damage, then it consumes those combo points, which then means you have to rebuild them back up. Subtlety's main emphasis are going to be on certain buff mechanics such as Slice and Dice as well as Rupture during downtime, because Subtlety plays around two windows, either outside of a Shadow Dance window, which is where you do all your maintenance stuff and some of the smaller damage and sustained damage, as well as high damage Shadow Dance windows where you have to line up a bunch of cooldowns together to maximize your output, where you focus on certain finishes to deliver instant damage rather than the little maintenance buffs. So you have a maintenance rotation as well as a burst rotation every 30 seconds or so. Now Subtlety's big emphasis, massive emphasis, is going to be on the amount of cooldowns you have to manage, and there's a lot of little tiny cooldowns that you have to manage, and even more depending on the types of builds that you're running, because there's so many different buttons that you have to combine together. And managing all those cooldowns is going to be the difficulty curve of Subtlety. The actual rotation is ridiculously easy, but the cooldown management, that is where the difficulty of the spec comes from. Outside of Shadow Dance, we're going to want to generate some combo points. As you auto-attack the target, you get a passive proc of Shadow Technique, so you want to make sure you're constantly auto-attacking and target. Your auto-attacks have a 31% chance to generate 7 energy and store 1 combo point up to 14. Attacks that generate a combo point can actually use up and expend those stored combo points to generate additional combo points up to your maximum. So basic abilities such as Backstab, which is going to be how you're going to build combo points in single target, normally generates 1 single combo point, but when you have a couple of these stored combo points with Shadow Techniques, you actually get full 5 combo points instantly, which allows you to then spend them on your finishers. Now, combo point generators are going to be different depending on the content that you're doing. If you're fighting a single target, Backstab is going to be a primary combo point builder. However, outside of Shadow Dance, if you're ever fighting 2 or more targets, you actually switch to Shuriken Storm. This ability generates 1 combo point per target hit. So the more enemies you're fighting, the more combo points is going to generate instantly. So depending on your situation, you'll simply be adjusting between Backstab and Shuriken Storm when playing outside of your Shadow Dance windows. So now that we can build combo points, once we reach 6 or more combo points as our Subtlety rogue, then we want to spend them on finishers. Outside of Shadow Dance, this finisher's priority is going to include Slice and Dice. Slice and Dice is an attack that increases our auto attack speed by 50%. This directly interacts with shadowy techniques, allowing us to generate more energy, but also more combo points, which allows us to alleviate our resource generation. Once Slice and Dice is active, it's a good idea to also put a Rupture on the primary target, as well as any other targets that are going to be alive for a while in AoE content. Rupture is a very effective blade that deals a considerable amount of damage. Rupture should also be refreshed at 9 seconds if it's about to fall off. This allows those 9 seconds of Rupture to be transferred into a fresh new Rupture through a mechanic called Pandemic, where those leftover seconds of Rupture get to be added into a fresh new Rupture, allowing you 100% uptime of the bleed at all times. Once both Slice and Dice as well as Rupture are on the target and don't need to be refreshed, the rest of your combo points in single target, you're going to be investing into Eviscerate. Eviscerate is going to be your primary combo point spender once all those maintenance buffs are active. And we'll be prioritizing Eviscerate against less than 3 targets. So when fighting 1 or 2 targets, you always Eviscerate your priority target. Eviscerate can also be used as a priority finisher instead. where you could generate a ton of comp points with abilities such as your Shuriken Storm, but if let's say the enemy that's in front of you needs to die and they're a higher priority than all the other targets, instead of padding and cleaving everything around you, which will let you do more damage, but it's just pad damage, you're just padding those numbers, you could use Eviscerate to have more impactful value gain for that ability, doing priority damage while being able to focus down that specific core target. This is a unique mechanic for Subtlety. Technically, it results in less overall damage, but much better focus damage. And in raids and in dungeons, having that focus damage can be a huge boon for your entire raid and party. However, if you don't need to be focusing a target down, you should be using Black Powder at 3 or more targets. Black Powder is essentially an AoE version of Eviscerate. While Eviscerate deals good single target damage, Black Powder deals good AoE damage. Though both Eviscerate and Black Powder follow the same priority of you have to first get a Slice and Dice up and running, as well as ruptures on all active targets before you start spending comp points on either Black Powder or Eviscerate. And that's going to be the general priority rotation of Subtlety, of how you generate comp points and build them and spend them outside of Shadow Dance. Now, Shadow Dance is a cooldown that allows us to basically enter a stealth-based state without necessarily diving into stealth, because once in combat, you can't re-stealth until you leave out of combat. But Shadow Dance lets Subtlety rogues dip into that stealth state for a moment, allowing us to access stealth-based abilities, specifically Shadow Strike, which is an ability that you can only use from stealth. Basically, think of it as in a much more empowered version of Backstab, where Backstab chips away at the target, Shadow Strikes obliterates the target with a massive strike that deals increased damage, generates a ton of comp points, and is just a much more effective of an ability. During Shadow Dance, we also gain 30% more damage, which makes it a big burst ability. Shadow Dance also has 2 charges that allows us to flexibly use this ability to dip in and out of stealth when we need to. But knowing how to change your rotation whenever you enter Shadow Dance during that burst window is important. With Shadow Dance, we are going to replace Backstab with Shadow Strike, like I said, as our primary single target combo point builder. And Shadow Dance maintains that primary single target comp point builder until we're fighting 4 or more targets, where Shuriken Storm ends up being a much better ability for it. This will change a little bit depending if you're playing Trickster or Deathstalker, but for the most part, Shadow Strike is a single target ability, and Shuriken Storm is when you're fighting +3 targets. Now, during Shadow Dance, we're no longer doing the maintenance buff. We don't need Slice and Dice or Rupture. We're looking to deal the most amount of damage available. And we start using our finishers at 5 comp points or more, because Shadow Strike and your Shuriken Storm allow you to generate comp points much more effectively, and we want to make sure we're not overbuilding comp points and are spending them as quickly as we can get. During that time, you're going to be primarily prioritizing Eviscerate for single target, or Black Powder if you're fighting 3 or more targets. But we're also going to be adding another finisher called Secret Technique into the mix as well. Secret Techniques is going to be your highest priority finisher, though you want to delay it until it is your second finisher. This is primarily because of the mechanic of Dance Macabre, but during Shadow Dance, every single new ability you press increases your damage by 6%. So if, let's say, you're using Shadow Strike during Dance, and then you Eviscerate, that's 6 and 6 damage increase. Then let's say you Shadow Strike and then Secret Technique, that adds 6% on top of it, making Secret Technique a little bit more effective. And that's the only little thing you want to do, is kind of try to use Secret Technique as your second finisher during Shadow Dance. So what it'll look like for the most part, at least in single target, is you'll Dance, press and Eviscerate, then Shadow Strike again, and then you'll Secret Technique after, then keep building combo points and spending them mostly on Eviscerates. And in AoE, you are switching it up by using Shuriken Storm as well as Black Powder, while also weaving in a Secret Technique in the same way that you do with Shadow Strikes and Eviscerates. And remember that in Dance, we want to use finishers at 5 comp points or more. So instead of 6 being a minimum, you have 5 as the minimum, which allows us for more aggressive finisher usage during our main big bursty window. So now that we got the basics of how you play Subtlety outside of Shadow Dance, and then how you play Subtlety inside of Shadow Dance, which on their own are not that difficult, and once you start playing the spec and running into dungeons and playing around with all these different abilities, and once you start practicing it against Train Dummy or taking it into dungeons, it really is a easy to play rotation. Where the difficulty of Subtlety comes from is management and remembering how to use all of the various cooldowns, which is going to be how you're going to be dealing a lot of your damage output. And now for the long-awaited cooldown section. With cooldowns, we got a lot of things to manage, but I'll try to explain them as simply and easily as possible. So we have the first cooldown, which is called Symbols of Death. It is a cooldown with a 25-second CD, although you can have it a little bit longer depending on how you talent into your rogue, where you invoke the ancient symbols of power, generating instantly 40 energy, increasing your damage by 10% for 10 seconds. Ideally, you want to use this ability on cooldown whenever it is active. This is the only ability you use on cooldown freely on its own, and you want to try to use as many Symbols of Death throughout a window as possible. You also can refresh the cooldown or the uptime of this buff when it has 3 seconds or less remaining for the pandemic uptime, but that's mostly an opener type of mechanic that you're not really going to encounter in most situations. But try to use Symbols of Death as often as possible throughout a combat encounter. Shadow Dance, we talked about earlier, is an ability with a 1-minute recharge but with 2 charges. For the most part, we'll be using Shadow Dance whenever we're at low comm points to generate it quickly with a Shadow Strike or a Shuriken Storm, and we'll usually pair it together with Symbols of Death. We almost never use Shadow Dance on its own unless the buff itself is about to cap out on 2 charges, but in most cases you're going to be weaving Shadow Dance to pair it together with the Symbols of Death. If a charge is available, and during certain moments when a charge isn't available, it's perfectly fine to send Symbols of Death on its own by itself without a Shadow Dance as a pair. Inside of Shadow Dance, we'll be combining a couple of different cooldowns like Cold Blood. Cold Blood will be used just before you use a secret technique, and that's the only reason why we run Cold Blood is to increase the effectiveness of secret technique and give it a guaranteed critical strike chance. So Cold Blood will only be delayed for secret technique, but secret technique will only be used inside of a Shadow Dance, which is kind of combine them together here. If you're playing like a Mythic Plus AoE build, you're going to be running a buff of Subtlety, or rather a cooldown of Subtlety, which restores your energy by 100% while buffing your mastery by 19.6%, which is quite a lot. For the most part, we'll be using Subtlety together with Shadow Dance. For the most, you could actually combine the 2 abilities and macro them together if you want to, but Subtlety is only used inside of Shadow Dance windows. Now, some of your other big cooldowns are going to be Flagellation as well as Shadow Blades. Flagellation is an ability that allows you to lash the target for a bunch of shadow damage, and after using this ability, every common point you spend into a finisher causes the lash to deal additional shadow damage while increasing your mastery by 2.5% per stack. Our mastery increases the damage of all our finishers, so Eviscerate, Rupture, Secret Technique, Black Powder, so being able to line up a solid Flagellation is a good move. The Flagellation should never be used on its own. You always pair it together with Shadow Blades. Shadow Blades is a 2-minute cooldown. Flagellation is a 1.5-minute cooldown. So you will delay using Flagellation until Shadow Blades is available. With Shadow Blades, you draw up on the surrounding shadows, causing your abilities to deal 20% additional damage as shadow damage, and common point generating abilities will generate full common points, maxing you out for 20 seconds, which allows us to churn through a bunch of finishers very, very effectively. This is why you're combining these abilities together, so Flagellation will always be used with Shadow Blades at the same time. The final cooldown to talk about is Vanish. Vanish, we all have 2 charges off or a single charge off. By itself, Vanish is not an impressive ability, because all it does is allows us to get a moment of stealth for 3 seconds. The Vanish will become an actual combat ability for us to use because of Invigorating Shadow Dust, where Vanish will actually reduce the cooldown of all our major abilities by 30 seconds. This includes our Shadow Blades, includes our Flagellation, as well as Shadow Dance, Symbols of Death, Subtlety, and Cold Blood, all our major cooldowns, so this ability resets all of them. The main way we're going to be using Vanish is normally after using Secret Technique within Shadow Dance windows, usually while Flagellation as well as Shadow Blades are both on cooldown. And that's the only way you really want to use Vanish, is when both of these major abilities are on cooldown shortly after a Secret Technique instead of a Shadow Dance window. So it has a very specific use case, and you only use it whenever those cooldowns are available. And that on its own, managing those cooldowns and timing them at a correct time is going to be the most difficult part of Subtlety. Than a newer player, I feel like if you're just going into the class and you pick Subtlety as your playstyle for PvE, this whole mechanic is going to make a head spin. It is the hardest part to manage. The actual rotation is easy. Managing those cooldowns is difficult. We do have an opener that allows us to kind of situate those cooldowns in a correct way, where you're using them appropriately, and then it kind of allows you to start using cooldowns on cooldown. But this is going to be the hardest part, so if you have a trouble with Subtlety and cooldowns, this part is going to take some practice in raids and dungeons to get it right and do it correctly. So the opener is going to look something like this. You'll start in stealth and make sure your poisons are active on your rogue, and you'll start off with a Shadow Strike in order to get primed. This is going to generate plenty of combo points to sink him immediately into Slice and Dice. After 1 or 2 Shadow Strikes, depending on how many combo points you generate, you can follow up into a Flagellation, Rupture, pop all of your cooldowns together with Dance, follow up with a Shadow Strike, Cold Blood, Secret Technique, and then Vanish to reset your cooldowns. And from there you go on with your rotation, building combo points to try to spend them as efficiently as possible. And then your cooldown window is going to look something like this. You're going to get really aggressively during your opener, where you're going to prioritize sending 2 Symbols of Death, 3 Shadow Dances, a Flagellation, and a Shadow Blades, as well as a Vanish in your opener. And after those cooldowns are down, the next time Symbols of Death is available, you want to use it immediately by itself, and continue building and spending combo points in the same priority that we discussed before. Later down the line, you're going to be able to combine a single dance and a single Symbols of Death together, and by then all of your cooldowns are coming back up, where you again invest the entire menagerie of cooldowns all together, making sure to save your Flagellation for when Shadow Blades is available and combine them together accordingly. And then you also will use Vanish during that window, where you'll kind of restart that rotation. And that doesn't really change too much when it comes to AoE. You're simply replacing your, instead of backstabs and shadow strikes, your circuit storms in order to generate combo points. In AoE, however, you are going to generate more combo points regularly, so you'll be actually getting an influx of shadow dances. So you may actually end up sending more shadow dances together with some of the deaths a little bit more aggressively. But for the most part, it's going to be how you manage cooldowns as a subtlety, creating a profile where in the opener you have a good set of cooldowns, and then you can burst effectively with all CDs every 90 seconds at max. Now I want to go over some of the rotational adjustments you'll have depending on your hero spec. With Deathstalker, you gotta play around the main ability as well as the capstone ability, but the main adjustment you're gonna see in the Darkest Night. After you consume all of your Deathstalker's mark, which you will generate from Shadow Striking the target, which is easy to do, and then you invest 5 combo points to finishers in order to consume stacks. After all 3 stacks are consumed, the next Eviscerate with max combo points is a guaranteed crit and deals 60% more damage. You'll have to commit extra combo points beyond the 5 and 6, depending on in-dance windows or out-of-dance windows, in order to benefit from this buff, and it's crucial that you do so. Cleave the Witness is another one we're talking about. It basically makes Shuriken Storm worth using in single target outside of Shadow Dance in order to generate an extra combo point, because it generates an extra combo point, but also deals additional plague damage. That's the only real adjustment you will see with Deathstalker, is having to use Shuriken Storm outside of dances in single target situations. Now, Deathstalker adjustments are pretty easy, though Trickster is a lot more nuanced, because Trickster has a few gameplay implications, especially when it comes to AoE damage, but also in how to maximize the use of your capstone ability. So your capstone ability, like we mentioned before, is Coup de Grace. It replaces your Eviscerate with a Coup de Grace, which is a more empowered version of the Eviscerate ability. I was about to call it a Coup de Grace again, just for the sake of it. But basically, you want to play around the Unseen Blade stacks, because that's how you know when you're about to reach Coup de Grace. Every time you backstab or every time you Shadow Strike, you get the proc of the Unseen Blade. It goes on a cooldown for a short time, but abilities such as your Secret Technique as well as auto attacks can reset, so you can actually get the Escalating Blade ability just a little bit quicker. So when you're nearing the 4 stacks of your Coup de Grace, and when you do finally get Coup de Grace, ideally you want to use Coup de Grace inside of your Shadow Dance as an Eviscerate. But sometimes you'll be going through your finishers, going through your combo points, and your Shadow Dance is not available. Let's say you're mid Shadow Dance, right? You're going for Shadow Strikes, you get in your Eviscerates, and oh, Shadow Dance right out. Let's just create that situation, right? You just left Shadow Dance, and then you got a proc a Coup de Grace. What do you do in this situation? You could just send Coup de Grace natty, but that's not the most effective way of using the ability. Actually, it's a lot better to save Coup de Grace for when your Shadow Dance is back up and available. And during that time, you can't use Eviscerate. You're locked out of the ability, so you will default to actually using Black Powder, even in single target situations. It's a bit of an awkward adjustment, but it's actually better to save Coup de Grace and use it once you get into Shadow Dance. You also want to make sure that the enemy is phased, so they have the debuff of phased on him before you use Coup de Grace. It is imperative because this allows Coup de Grace to generate 5 stacks of Flawless Form, which increases the effectiveness of your finishes right afterwards. So you want to make sure phase is available, then you will use Coup de Grace inside of your Shadow Dance to make sure that you're getting the full value procs of all your abilities, and this allows you to just deal the most amount of damage. And this is a slight DPS increase, but it's significant enough where you do want to try to play around this ability, which is going to give you a slightly different damage profile. Speaking of your rotational damage profile, we also have the passive of Nimble Flurry, which allows Subtlety rogues to cleave like as if you're a combat or an outlaw rogue with a Blade Flurry ability. Now normally, Subtlety will use as a Shuriken Storm ability in AoE to generate combo points. Trickster almost never uses Shuriken Storm to generate combo points in AoE, especially during Shadow Dance because of the Nimble Flurry ability. While Flawless Form is active, auto attacks, backstab, shadow strike, and eviscerate cleave summon nearby targets. So as long as this buff is active, which you activate either through Secret Technique or Unseen Blade, as long as it's up, you have more of this single target type of priority of your abilities. This means that if, let's say, you are in an AoE environment and you have the buff active, instead of using Black Powder to AoE, you'll actually use Eviscerate as an AoE ability. And this allows Nimble Flurry to actually cleave things around you, which creates for some fantastic AoE damage. This does a ton of overall damage and is definitely worth playing into. Now, outside of dances, you're still going to be prioritizing Shuriken Storm, though it's not a bad idea to weave in a backstab just so you can activate the phase debuff, just so you can get yourself Flawless Form going. Where this really becomes fun is inside of dance windows where you spam in Shadow Strikes. As long as Flawless Form is active, you're able to spam Shadow Strikes and Eviscerates and Coup de Grace and as a single target AoE priority. So it's a mechanic where you are mostly prioritizing single target Shadow Strikes and Eviscerates, so you have high priority damage, while cleaving things for free with Nimble Flurry active. And this only applies to Trickster because of the way Nimble Flurry works. So just remember, during dance, you're Shadow Striking. You're not going to be Shuriken Storming at all. And you'll be prioritizing Eviscerate over Black Powder as your main combo point finisher outside of your Secret Technique, while Nimble Flurry is active. And Nimble Flurry is only active while Flawless Form is active, so you want to carefully track maybe with a weak aura or two Flawless Form and its overall uptime. From here on, I want to go over about gearing when it comes to optimizing and itemizing your rogue, starting with gearing and general stats. For the most part, if you are serious about playing your Subtlety rogue in this expansion, I recommend checking out the website of Raidbots as well as the add-on of Simcraft. I'll have both of them linked down in the description of this video, but this allows you to itemize and optimize your rogue by taking the actual sim of your character, which is all the detailed information from your ratios to your gear to your talents and everything that's in your bags, and compare items against each other to find the best possible gear for your character to wear, either setting it up for situations such as raiding content like patchwork single target 5-minute fights, which is the average PvE raid encounter more or less, but also dungeon situations with dungeon slice in order to see what kind of stats and what kind of gear your character would prefer depending on the content that you want to dive into. But if you do want to get more of a general idea when it comes to Subtlety, I do have a couple of suggestions in terms of gear as well as stats. Your best stats for Subtlety generally is going to be if someone has a higher item level, generally it's going to be better for you because it gives you agility, which is our primary stat that we're looking forward to. Agility increases the effectiveness of all our basic abilities. Besides this though, with secondary stats we do have a bit of a priority. Mastery is your best option as it increases the effectiveness of your finishers, and both Deathstalker as well as Trickster play heavily around the finisher damage, so Mastery is heavily emphasized. The other stat that's also good for us is Versatility, which buffs the damage of our finishers, but also things like Backstab, as well as those Shadow Strikes, so it increases the damage of those things that are already buffed up, plus the combo point builders as well. Critical Strike is another good stat that allows us to get a higher chance for our abilities to crit. And Haste is our least important stat. Technically, Haste does have some value because the more we auto-attack, the more combo points and energy we can build, but we don't necessarily need energy during our major cooldowns, which is where the priority damage comes from Subtlety. As for dungeon and raid items you're going to be looking forward to, right now in the Nuremberg Palace and in the current season's raid tier, there aren't too many daggers that you'll want that have a specific effect, so you're really trying to prioritize daggers that have a good secondary stats. And to be honest, there's not a lot of those, but if you do want specific daggers, the Rookery daggers with Mastery Versatility do offer the perfect secondary stats you want if you're trying to target farm certain specific items. As for trinkets, majority of your best trinkets are actually going to come from the raid of Nuremberg Palace. Some of your best trinkets are going to be the Treacherous Transmitter, which is a trinket with a 1.5 minute cooldown, which lines up perfectly with your Shadow Blade's ability, especially when you're playing the cooldown reduction talent, allowing us to gain a considerable bit of agility for 15 seconds during our peak burst cooldowns, which makes it the best trinket for the Spec of Subtlety. Other good options are going to be the Void Reaper's Contract, which is a decent passive trinket that's not necessarily worth getting the secondary bonus for, but the trinket on its own is a decent bit of a gain. Another trinket that's also good is the Blood Twister's Alvenax Mercurial Egg trinket, which is a bit of a weird one. Basically, if you stand still, this trinket grants you a bunch of primary stats, and while you're moving, this trinket then transfers that primary stat into your secondary stats. But it basically has a certain number of stats it provides you, and it just splits it between agility as well as mastery, preferably, if that is your highest secondary stat, depending on how much you move it around. Using the effect of the trinket suspends the actual movement of these stats and freezes them for a short moment. Basically, it's a passive amount of agility and mastery at best case. Most people in beta use this trinket not for the active effect, but for the passive effect that it provided, just for additional secondary and primary stats. When it comes to dungeon trinkets, there's not too many good options. The Deadeye Spyglass from Captain Lockwood in Borealis is a certainly viable option. But even the trinket from Arakara of Sagbrid is also pretty good. It has haste, which is not ideal, but the actual agility it provides and the consistency of that trinket does make it a solid bit overall for any spec in the game, even a spec like Subtlety, which doesn't necessarily prioritize haste as a stat. Next, we got a quick note on crafted gear. Right now, due to the volatility of tuning when it comes to crafted items, it's a good idea to save your spark until maybe the heroic week or even the mythic week of endgame content, because they may end up tuning a lot of the embellished items a little bit better, because embellishments are fairly low in terms of your overall damage value. Though right now for Subtlety, if you are going to be using embellishments on your gear, you actually want to go for boots and bracers, and what you'll be combining them together is with an embellishment of Elemental Focusing Lens, which will deal additional spell damage based on the bonuses you have when it comes to your gems. So this one is kind of like an endgame type of embellishment, because you're not really going to be able to get a bunch of gems in your gear early on into the expansion, but being able to put gems in your rings as well as necklace will at least get you started with a little bit of additional prismatic damage. Another option that's recommended maybe for dungeon content is Dusk Thread Lightning, which provides you with additional versatility while above 80% health. The problem though is versatility isn't your best stat. Like if this was mastery, this would be an easy take. But versatility is a decent stat, though not as good as mastery, so it's a viable alternative option. But as it stands right now, if you are trying to go for the most amount of damage, right now in Sims, Elemental Focusing Lens seems to be the best option, though like I said before, most embellishments and items are not nearly as strong as they were during expansion of Dragonflight. So best to just wait until maybe they do some tuning, maybe some will get buffed up super high, and then you'll have a more of like a set in stone answer. So be very careful with the spark that you get and the limitations of sparks that you have right now in the current moment. Then as for the enchants, when it comes to the spec of Subtlety Rogue, your enchants are going to be for the weapon. Specifically, you're going to mostly want to focus on Authority of the Depths for both of your main hand and offhand weapons. For your cloak, you're going to want to go with the enchant of Winged Grace. For your chest, Crystalline Radiance for extra primary stats. Bracers are usually enchanted with Armored Avoidance. That can be swapped out to leech in some fights where there's not a lot of group-wide, raid-wide damage, but generally avoidance is the play. For your pants, you want to embolden one with a Defender's Armor Kit. For your boots, you want to get the Defender's March. And for the ring, you're going to mostly focus on either Radiant Mastery or Cursed Mastery. Radiant provides you a set amount of stats, while Cursed provides you more mastery, but at a cost of other secondary stats. So you may have to run those through Sims in order to get the best values. As for the consumables, you want to go with a Flask of Alchemical Chaos or the Mastery Flask, but Alchemical Chaos, as of right now, is highly recommended because it synergizes together with a Potion of Tempered Potion, which gives you a lot of secondary stats. Based on the Chaos Flask that you have, it basically provides you all the other stats that you currently don't have. And Subtlety does end up using Mastery, Versatility, and Critical Strikes, so getting a mix of stats is still fairly solid. Algaria health potions are going to be great for self-survivability, while Iron Claw whetstones will be used in your weapons to give you a little bit extra power. Crystallized Augment Runes are going to be very expensive at the beginning of the season, so I don't necessarily recommend getting them unless you're going to be doing some really high-end endgame content, and then that means you'll need to get a little bit of capital in order to store this up. For raids, in terms of feasts, you'll usually be using Feast of Midnight Masquerade, but any raid feast that or any personal food feast that gives you mastery or agility or even versatility are all solid options. For your gems, you'll want to run at least one culminating Blasphemite in your gear, but the rest of your gems should be filled with versatile Onyx for your best secondary stats. Though because of culminated Blasphemite, it might be a good idea to just sim your character to figure out the best gem priority, because the more variety of gems you have, the better Blasphemite is going to be. So it's going to be a bit of a balancing act between getting your best secondary stats with versatile Onyx versus trying to get the value of the Blasphemite gem. So use Raidbots in order to figure out the best combination that's going to be the most effective for each and every one of your characters. But with that being said, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching the video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. It helps boost the channel out into the YouTube algorithm, helps get my videos out there, and it helps out a ton, especially during the launch of a new expansion. As always, join our Discord community if you guys want to get access to the guide, or if you got a new rogue question specifically. Usually I'm around, or other rogue players are around in the Discord community. All of them are nice, none of them bite, and all of them are more than happy to help out new players to get set up and figure out how to play the class of rogue. At the very least, maybe I could be there in the Discord as well to answer some of your questions if you have anything specifically. Also a great place to reach out to me directly if you got any questions regarding the rogue guide. Join our Discord community, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see all of you guys in the next one.